Welcome back, honeys. Today we're talking about an artist that I'm not terribly familiar with, or at least I wasn't prior to doing the episode research, but whose name I've been seeing pop up quite a bit in the art world lately. So today we'll be taking a look at the life and the impactful artwork of José María Velasco, who lived 1840 to 1912. The London National Gallery, one of our sources for today, alongside The Guardian, Hyperallergic, Smart History, Daily Art Magazine, and so on, writes that he is, quote, famed for his monumental paintings of the Valley of Mexico, the area surrounding Mexico City, the nation's capital. Painted during decades of tremendous social change, his precise yet lyrical works depicted Mexico's magnificent scenery and rapid industrialization, end quote. And without any further ado, your episode. Velasco's early life is not incredibly clear to us. We know he was born in 1840, we know he was orphaned in childhood, and we know he was brought up in poverty at the foot of a small hill outside Mexico City called the Hill of Tepeyac, with enormous Christian religious significance that we'll come back to later, but there's little clarity on what it was like for him coming of age in a new nation. Mexico had gained freedom in 1821 and quickly got to work demonstrating that it was ready for business, for growth, as well as for creating its own identity, which meant the beginning of a new national art. And here's something I bet you didn't know. The first art school in the Americas was established in Mexico City in the late 18th century, more specifically 1785, after decades of Creole artists pushing the Spanish monarchy to create one. The institution, dubbed the Royal Academy of San Carlos, was modeled after the Art Academy of San Fernando in Madrid, but, quote, fostered romantic and neoclassical aesthetics through previously unexplored genres of painting, end quote, according to Khan Academy. So the students emerging from that new school began to illustrate what was around them, the local vistas of the Valley of Mexico, as the popularity of the landscape genre rose in the academy, especially in the 19th century. The rise of the landscape genre in the Mexican art scene was also partially due to the influence of Italian professor at the school and landscape artist himself, Eugenio Landesio. Our sources argue that Landesio's European influence shows up in the use of plein air painting, the classical echoes of Velasco's work, for example, atmospheric perspective use, the sort of order, the landscape framing tricks used that make the central horizon seem deeper and more grand. The rise of landscape art is also partially due to the fact that during this Romantic era, it seemed to offer the perfect opportunity for Latin American artists to explore the qualities of the land and symbols around them, as well as to differentiate themselves from their European and American counterparts. By that I mean that while late 18th and 19th century Europeans and Americans used landscape art as a show of nature's power, as a record of ownership or estate, as a format for exploring the representation of new technologies, or even as pure metaphor in the case of unmarked landscape being one for American exceptionalism, Mexican artists of the day aimed to document the land accurately and descriptively as a method of communicating their sense of pride in their country's past, present, and future. Latin American artists, on the whole, often filtered their views of nature through either historic or regional specificity. They didn't just capture images of unspoiled natural beauty. And unlike these counterparts, they were also willing to show industrial progress and nature as collaborators working in cohesion rather than as competitors. Smart History explains, quote, minor yet significant details may seem lost in the work of foreigners who instead focus on more iconic sites. Yet even when depicting something as iconic as the mountain Cotopaxi, the view of the insider may differ, since for locals these views were not exotic, but rather a part of their immediate world waiting to be repurposed for an awakening nationalist spirit. Depicting local sites allowed native artists to craft a new sense of cultural identity while also reclaiming their historical past, end quote. All that to say that landscapes exploded in popularity amongst Mexican artists of this day because they were not only commercially popular, but, quote, an opportunity to highlight symbols of patriotism valuable to a newly independent society, end quote. Unfortunately, this story is not all sunshine and roses. The development of this practice, this national landscape painting, was also a part of dictator López de Santa Anna's efforts to reestablish the Art Academy after decades of neglect that followed independence. The popularity of landscapes also relates to this context, the fact that Mexico was invaded by Americans in 1840, then ceded some of its vast territory southwest of the U.S. under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but was still facing incursions from the north, and in 1860s was invaded by Napoleon's French troops. The nation needed ways to continue defining itself and connecting its people through these rough early years. It was not not the sole intention of the artists, but it was useful for politics. Now, you may be wondering, where did our artist go in all of this? So let's talk about Velasco as a part of the Mexican Romantic movement. He was much more than just a painter of the nation. Quote, a true polymath, he was also a botanist, naturalist, and geologist with highly developed interests in both Mesoamerican and modern history, end quote. He in fact began his commercial career by producing various botanical and zoological illustrations for a range of publications, succeeding in his goals to be as true to life as possible, to the degree that some of our sources say his artworks are still used as sources by environmental historians today. And I will say, honeys, you should see his axolotl drawings, which he published well-received papers about. The London National Gallery explains that he approached drawing and painting as part of a quasi-scientific process using multiple ways of developing and expressing empirical knowledge, not just in a hunt for or expression of beauty. That multidisciplinary approach might be why, even though his paintings are so varied, they all explore the relationships between different cultures across time, Mexico's mountainous terrain, flora and fauna, and the impact of industrialization, especially on the land. Velasco was also a founding member of the Sociedad Mexicana de Historia Natural and went on to republish scientific drawings in their Naturaleza magazine. At some point, according to our sources, he identified a new species of salamander that lives in a lake near Mexico City, and his scientific interest showed up in his artwork sometimes as well. For example, in Eruption, 1910, which depicts an exploding volcano top from a nearby sidelong position, or his work Study of Clouds from 1912. For those reasons, I think it's best to look at Velasco as a quote-unquote connected individual. His compositions united pre-Hispanic symbols and contemporary national sentiments with extraordinary skill. Our sources say Velasco, quote, presented a monumentality and an open quality to his image that surpassed compositions created by his Italian mentor, end quote, completed at similar times, showing his progression beyond the norms of European Romanticism and pushing the boundaries of Latin American Romanticism. Probably the best example of this, and by far Velasco's most well-known work, is The Valley of Mexico from the Santa Ana Isabel mountain range, completed in 1875. This version is the most celebrated of a dozen or so with the same subject done by the artist between 1875 and 1892. He really liked this location and painted it a lot. It was notably done for the 1876 American Centennial celebrations in Philadelphia, and while Velasco claimed to have painted the entire thing outdoors on site, scholars think that's pretty unlikely based on the size of the piece and the existence of other preparatory sketches. It's more likely he did those sketches on site, but created this piece in a studio so that he could get exactly the details he wanted in controlled settings. In this piece, as in others of his, Velasco's vistas rely on what Hyperallergic calls staggering technical draftsmanship to create believable and off-putting senses of a real drop-off a cliff, whereas narrative landscapes usually layer artificially, like scenery on a stage, to construct their depth. And a crucial change Velasco made here was raising the horizon line from other works so that the sky only occupies a third of the canvas rather than half of the composition, which allows him to expand the foreground and thus the narrative potential of the piece. And as Smart History contributor Dr. Kilroy Eubank puts it, quote, Velasco is using light and shadow to guide our eye in this wonderful zigzag motion so that we recede from the foreground all the way into the back to the city itself, end quote. The work is loaded with signs of Velasco's personal ties to national identity. For example, he signed the work on one of the foreground rocks, quote, José María Velasco, Pintor Mexicano, doubling down on his regional identity. Yet what's fascinating about the work is that some of these hints and symbols are more indirect. Velasco makes it clear that the represented territory is Mexico City through historic and observed references rather than giving us a view straight from nature. The famed mountain peaks surrounding the city at the right and the volcano tops at the left are featured in the far distance. The foreground, however, features an eagle that appears to have just taken flight from a cactus with prey in its mouth. This is iconic imagery in Mexico because of its relation to the Aztec migration / Tenochtitlan founding story, wherein the Mexica patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, told them to look for a sign similar to this one so that they would know where to settle after making a long journey from their ancestral homeland. The group established their city in the site where they did indeed see that eagle eating its prey atop a cactus. That combination remains the central central symbol of the Mexican flag to this day. We also see in the middle ground of this painting, which is still pretty far away, you can make out the Plaza del Zocalo, the ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan, and the contemporary main square, where Tenochtitlan was founded in 1325, forming another reference to Mexico's indigenous past. We can also just make out the hill of Tepeyac nearby, which our sources explain, quote, was also an important sacred colonial site where the Virgin of Guadalupe first appeared to the indigenous man Juan Diego in 1531, end quote. And that inclusion, more than any others, reflects what makes his work so unique. Velasco gives us the sense of a long and expansive history reaching back to ancient civilizations without entirely detaching from the present. The Virgin Guadalupe herself spans that gap as a consistent key symbol of Mexican national identity. She reportedly had mestizo features and spoke Nahuatl, the most widespread indigenous language in the Americas still, but was also used as a rallying point and promoted as a patroness of the Mexican Revolution by the priest who began the uprising which led to it, Miguel Hidalgo. The Virgin Guadalupe later appeared on the revolutionaries' banners and in their battle cries, as well as in Zapatistan protest art and other revolutionary and social movements. By referencing this figure who has maybe evolved in meaning but been a constant of Mexican national identity, he creates an anchor or a through line for all these different phases of history that he's referencing. Velasco also makes the choice here to put a couple figures in the foreground in traditional dress, but make them tiny, and that matters. Their size makes them insignificant, so the landscape takes the lead here, unlike in European Romanticism where the featured human figures do. Instead, this pair seems to serve as a marker of scale, and that traditional dress connects them to historical identity and ideas instead of European influences, so they also serve as visual connectors of the past to the future, the city in the distance. The presence of human figures also speaks to his stylistic evolution. His later versions of the Valley of Mexico, and other artworks for that matter, have no people. And because Velasco and his contemporaries did not shy away from featuring industrialization in nature, we can see hints of it visible here through the kicked up dust on the distant roads, as well as the spread of the city across the ancient lakeshore. Hyperallergic says that Velasco was so true to life and scientifically accurate in these views, quote, we can track the gradual industrialization and modernization of Mexico in his work via the dotted appearances of factory buildings or expanding cities in the topographical distance, end quote. An example of that would be the clarity, detail, and the prominence of the factory property matching that of the mountains and foregrounded foliage in Velasco's 1887 work, Textile Mill of La Carolina, Puebla. The idea of almost documenting or demonstrating environmental changes in the landscape, especially through the size of the lake shrinking over time and across his works, that concept of transition is also paralleled by the transitioning of skies to rainstorms across the artwork. Besides the technical feats and level of symbology that Velasco was able to pull off here, what has likely earned this piece its spot in the art historical canon is that the work can be viewed as a reinterpretation of the quote-unquote pastoral idyllis of late 18th century German art, which united a sense of poetic harmony and daily life through a figure that forms a key component of the poetics, the narrative, and is not just an accessory or filler/humanizer of the space. Other famed examples of the pastoral idyllis come from Caspar David Friedrich of Germany, John Constable in England, and Austrian Joseph Anton Koch. In this case, we have two figures, the traveling indigenous individuals' clothes, which form the national iconographic display, while their actions reflect the question of remaining rural or heading into the city, the difficult yet romanticized socio-economic relationship between the people and their ancestral land. But Velasco makes this popular format his own through the infusion of his scientific knowledge and accuracy, making it a standout in Mexican Romantic art. Although that particular view of the Valley of San Mexico is Velasco's most famous work, of course it is not his only work, so let's back it up to the 1860s for a minute. We'll begin with his 1862 work called A Rustic Bridge in San Angel, which shows Landesio's influence on Velasco most clearly, as the tree shape in this work is very similar to the central one from Landesio's 1839, the Apennines and Sub-Apennines. Both feature mountains behind the tree, although the mountains are different sizes and shape, and Velasco removes the frolicking figures and zooms in on that solo tree, choices that are in line with with Latin American Romanticism. And Velasco would definitely have been familiar with Landecio's work, as it was sent to the Academy San Carlos in Mexico prior to Velasco's enrollment in 1862 and remained in the school's collection for many years. We can also look to Gotthard of San Angel from 1863, of which he had made an 1861 version without people, also with blue or green tones, but he returns obviously to this idea a few years later. The 1863 version features a lot of foliage. We see quite a bit of Spanish moss here, and its cohesion is achieved through a limited color palette and the diagonal lines that draw the eye across the work, but also seem to hint at the industrial transition of the day through this split in the canvas. Closest to us in the left foreground, we have an agave plant, which is connected with all kinds of traditional products, most popularly known of which are, of course, tequila and mezcal. And beyond that, a goat herd leads his flock away from the left side of the riverbed, occupying the middle of the work, along a steep path that winds out of the frame, while in the far distance upriver, we can see some weathered structures, stairs and buildings through the trees that line the shore. At the right, however, are multi-story high buildings with an unrealistic number of windows and smokestacks pouring gray into the skies, while a seemingly armed figure stands watch on the closest rooftop. Many of the trees on this bank are in shadow for some inexplicable reason. Read left to right, this painting seems to dichotomize older and newer times and suggest that the old is being driven out or overtaken by the new. We'll briefly discuss the Almeida of Mexico from 1866 because it shows Velasco's progression as an artist. This one is more like a genre painting, wherein the woman, riding side saddle in the center, is thought to be Maximilian's wife Carlotta. This speaks to his awareness of the shifting politics of his own day. It also marks a departure from his typical subject matter. 1874 sees Velasco's completion of Rocks on the Hill of Azcapotzalco. In this piece, women in long skirts and a man in a white suit with a parasol are dwarfed by the rocks looming over them alongside the path, embedded with white crystal as the group walks steadily along. Yet Velasco seems more interested in the ancient rock formations than the people based on the detail, scale, and other compositional clues of each one. That fact is even more interesting when we compare this rocks piece from 1874 to his piece titled Rocks from 1894. The latter is notable for not having people or any evidence of people aside from a hardly visible path past the rocks, and uses less red tones, more of a chiaroscuro in brown. It's a major geological feature and calls back to the hill of Tepeyac as well. At this point, honeys, it's fair to ask the question, why rocks? According to the London National Gallery, that subject matter connects to his interests in new ideas about the age of the Earth, with scientists just starting to posit that Earth was over 40,000 years old instead of just 4,000 years old, and how some natural forms came to be. This is a show of something that came before us and has been affected by the millennia and has Velasco's attention for those reasons. And the impact of these artworks was pretty notable. Some of them, like his 1875 View of the Valley, were used by Mexican geologist Mariano Barcena to illustrate his lectures about geology in Philadelphia within Velasco's own lifetime. 1878, however, sees the production of The Baths of King Nezahualcóyotl. Velasco makes a really interesting choice here to focus more on the broken fragments, the ruins of the landscape, and treat them like an archaeological piece of the larger puzzle that is the landscape, very much avoiding a sort of Indiana Jones vibe along the way. Writes Jonathan Jones for Guardian, quote, "It feels mean and even redundant to say that Velasco is a bit dull. This admirable artist is, after all, proudly that. He cools the temperature with every smooth brushstroke, resisting the sublime effects that many other 19th century landscape artists in the Americas laid on with a shovel," end quote. Here, the sole bit of drama comes from the shape of the rock formation that the ruins rest atop, which mimics the head of a turtle outside of its shell. Although Velasco is well recognized for the vibrancy of his colors, especially his greens, this piece speaks to his mastery of yellows, browns, and purples. Also in 1878, Velasco completes Pyramid of the Sun and the Moon. This work was made under the direction of Guermosindo Mendoza, director of the National Museum of that time, and Velasco's boss for draftsperson work done at the museum. The piece once again features a road winding into the distance. The idea of travel, transition, and progression was repeated through this motif in Velasco's art. Furthermore, the pyramids featured here emerge more like foothills from the landscape than like man-made structures. This is not always the case with his other buildings, so makes this image feel all the more nostalgic, peaceful, and even timeless. They embody national identity again. The pyramids themselves are notable for existing already when the Aztecs and Mexica came to the valley in 1300 CE. CE, and these two are a repeat subject for Velasco. The 1870s is also the decade we see Velasco's art become symbolic of Mexico due to political use by his own countrymen. During the autocratic military regime of Porfirio Diaz from 1876 to 1911, Velasco's work was adopted by the state, acquired by the government as diplomatic gifts to be sent overseas. One went to an American president, Grant, and another to a pope, Leo VIII. Says Ralston of the London National Gallery, quote, "The timing was perfect. Landscape painting was taking over from history painting as a way to understand other nations. What did a country look like? What are its resources?" His work became the great example of what Mexico was, end quote, though little evidence exists of Velasco's own politics. Over the course of the next 20 years, the 1880s and 90s, Velasco receives many distinctions as Mexico's representative at numerous international exhibitions. Velasco's combinations of romantic European sensibilities and historical allegories became symbols of the nation, representing it in several world fairs and winning him important recognition in Chicago, Paris, and Philadelphia in the 19th century. For example, he won the Legion of Honor for representing Mexico at the 1889 Paris World Fair. And we've got two example artworks from this period, the first being the Metlac Ravine of 1893, which features the highest mountain in Mexico, Pico de Orizaba, also known as Citlao, which dominates the background. The Daily Art magazine points out, interestingly, that this composition recalls Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji, which was produced between 1830 and 1832 in Japan, and was, of course, a series of landscape prints. In this image by Velasco, however, the actual canyon is hardly visible, the train track dominates the work, and curves along the riverbed's natural path. Like many of his, this painting showcases Velasco's fascination with the vast natural richness and diversity of Mexico via the number of natural forms represented realistically and in detail. It's also suggestive of the early industrialization experienced during the artist's lifetime. This is another case wherein the, quote, imminent future, symbolized by the train, painted in the right-hand corner, overtakes nature, cuts the scenery, and moves the viewer with a whoosh, end quote. Notably, the railroad depicted here was built in 1877 to connect the capital with the biggest and oldest seaport in Mexico, Veracruz. Its creation was seen as an enormous undertaking and later success for the private investors and central government, as it afforded better control of the land as well as the promotion of trade and economic development. Our sources write, quote, "We can see how he was able to grasp the details and still show the story of the interplay of two forces that shape reality, nature, and human agency," end quote. The train runs at eye level in this piece in the middle of the artwork, curving to the left along its tracks, which disappear into a hillside tunnel. This train-centered artwork is his most reminiscent of Turner's famous Rain, Steam, Speed, the Great Western Railway of 1844, which he might have seen at the London National Gallery during Velasco's European visits, occurring between December of 1889 to about fall of the next year. He definitely spent time in Italian museums as well and may have picked up influences there. And our last one from the 1890s, Valley of Mexico from Molino del Rey, 1895. This artwork has a lot of horizontal line divisions and emphases. It's got a small barn, home, smokestack, and other details in the right foreground, with a larger white building in the leftish midground, some clearly denoted plants at the left, aloe and cacti, and I think that other one's creosote. And this is another artwork that shows Velasco's mastery of greens between the distinct trees and other features across the piece. But this one too is loaded with symbols of national identity that span the centuries. The White Mountain peaks in the distance here are the main characters of a legendary ill-fated love between an Aztec princess, Iztaccíhuatl, which translates to white woman, and a brave warrior named Popocatépetl, or Smoking Mountain, prior to the arrival of the Spanish to the Valley of Mexico in 1519. The story of the love between the two is very, very similar to the story of Romeo and Juliet, and both appear in many of his works. They form the furthest visible components of Lake Chalco from 1885 and are in the left background of the Valley of Mexico from the Santa Isabel Mountain Range 1875. What I notice about this work is that the shape of the spread of these mountains seems to mimic that of opening arms. It's got a very welcoming feel, which is a little atypical for Velasco. None of his landscapes are outright harsh or forbidding, I would say, but this one is especially warm. In 1901, however, Velasco suffered an accident that limited his mobility. His later works, according to Hyperallergic, are even more poetic, but they retain that quietness, subtlety, and monumentality from the earlier works. They do get significantly smaller in size, though. For an example, we can look to his work Temescalcingo of 1909, design. In it, a sloping green city in the middle of a light brown mountainous desert seems like an oasis, connected by dust and smoke from a train or something along the roads leading to the next quote-unquote oasis, barely visible through the foothills at our right. The town shown here seems like an Ozland or other equally unlikely fantasy more than a real place, especially with the lack of any life, aside from a shrub or two, outside of the city, which is fascinating since it does have great personal significance to him. As the caption he wrote states, "This is the town the artist was born in." Another example could be the Great Comet of 1882, completed in 1910. This is Velasco's visualization from memory of a great comet in the autumn of 1882 and shows a singular white swoosh cutting down and across a softly graded but otherwise pretty plain sky over what looks like a series of lagoons. The surprising thing about this painting is that some have suggested it was a rare moment of political commentary by Velasco. Some erroneously suggest that it foreshadows the upcoming Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century, ominously marking a moment of change, but no evidence proves that he foretold any of that. And just like his birth, not a ton is known about Velasco's death in 1912, other than that it happened, which means it is legacy time. Velasco was known in his day as one of Mexico's most eminent artists who showed work in Europe and the United States during his lifetime, but memory of him outside his home region faded quickly after his death. He does still hold great prominence in Mexico, however. Explains curator Daniel Sobrino Ralston of the London National Gallery, quote, "In Mexico, his public status is analogous to, say, Constable or Turner's in the UK," end quote, which makes sense given our other source authors' arguments that he was more, quote, "European academic and rationalist," end quote, than his contemporaries as well as Mexican artists of today. With the help of Diego Rivera, quote, "an admirer who had first encountered Velasco while a precocious 12-year-old art student," end quote, as Guardian puts it, Velasco was steadily restored to the center of Mexican cultural history. Rivera's work even strongly references Velasco at times, for example, the former's Zapatista landscape of 1915. And as I hinted at the top of the episode, recent efforts have put Velasco's name back into a broader spotlight, namely the exhibition titled José María Velasco, A View of Mexico, which is being celebrated as the first monographic exhibition of the artist in the UK and also the London National Gallery's first dedicated to a Latin American artist. Obviously, they were long overdue for some representation there, but it's sort of sweet that this show coincides with the 200th anniversary of the establishment of British-Mexican diplomatic relations in August of this year. A review of that show by Hyperallergic calls him, quote, "a technical powerhouse celebrating the physical entity of Mexico itself, importantly recording its history academically, rather than appealing to ingrained nationalistic European sensibilities of history painting," end quote. And with that, honeys, we've reached the end of our episode for today. We hope you've enjoyed this journey into Velasco's Mexico with us and all of the paintings along the way. And one last announcement before we go, yours truly will be a guest on somebody else's podcast in the next couple of weeks here. I'll be recording my interview with Business Spotlight on Monday, and we'll provide links to that resulting episode as soon as they are made available to me, so don't forget to check it out. Take care, hydrate or dehydrate, and happy November. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.